I walked into a small roadside restaurant just to get out of the rain. I wasn't even hungry. I just needed somewhere dry to sit for a few minutes before the long drive home. When the waitress turned around to take my order, I felt my heart stop completely. She was heavily pregnant, 8 months, maybe more, and she was my daughter-in-law. The woman my entire family had spent months believing was dead. And the first thing she whispered to me, with tears already forming in her eyes, was, "Please, don't tell Daniel I'm alive. If you enjoy dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Francisko's Stories for more. We post new stories every day, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next." Now let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this will make sense without it. My name is Robert. I'm 58 years old. I spent 30 years working as a civil engineer, and I like to think of myself as a practical man, a logical man. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in coincidences. I believe in facts and in reason. So when I tell you that what happened to me that rainy Tuesday afternoon shook me to my absolute core, I need you to understand exactly how much that means coming from someone like me. My son Daniel is 31 years old. He's tall, handsome, and charming in a way that people notice the moment he walks into a room. He got that from his mother, honestly. I was always the quieter one, the one standing in the corner at parties, nursing a drink and counting the minutes until I could go home. Daniel was never like that. Daniel could light up any room. He always had. He met Clara about 4 years ago at a company event. She worked in marketing at the same firm where he was a junior manager. When he brought her home for the first time, I remember my wife, Margaret, squeezing my hand under the dinner table. Later that night, when Clara had gone home, Margaret said to me, "Robert, that girl is something special." And she was right. Clara was warm and thoughtful and funny in a quiet, surprising way. She remembered details about people. The second time she visited, she brought me a book about the history of Roman aqueducts, because she had remembered, from one small comment I made 3 weeks earlier, that I was fascinated by ancient engineering. That's the kind of person she was. They got married 2 years later. Small ceremony, exactly the way Clara wanted it. She wore a simple dress and wildflowers in her hair, and she looked at my son like he was the whole world. I remember standing there thinking that I was the luckiest father alive. Then, 14 months ago, Clara disappeared. That's the only word any of us had for it. Disappeared. One Tuesday morning, Daniel called me. His voice was strange, tight and controlled, the way it gets when he's trying not to show emotion. "Dad," he said, "Clara's gone." I thought he meant gone to her parents' house, gone on a trip, gone in the ordinary way that people go somewhere. But no, he meant gone. Her phone switched off, her car left in the driveway, a small bag of her clothes missing, no note, no explanation, just absence. We called the police. We filed a report. We called her parents, who lived 3 hours away, and they drove to us immediately, pale-faced and shaking. We put up posters. Daniel hired a private investigator. Weeks turned into months, and the investigator found nothing. Clara's parents eventually moved back home, broken in a way I had never seen two people broken before. Her mother stopped eating properly. Her father aged 10 years and 10 months. And Daniel grieved the way I always feared he might grieve. Quietly, perfectly, too quietly, too perfectly. He went back to work after 2 weeks. He smiled at the right times and said the right things and never, not once in 14 months, broke down in front of me. I told myself that was just his way. I told myself that people process pain differently. I told myself a lot of things. Because I loved my son. Because when you love someone, you give them the benefit of your best interpretation. You fill in the gaps with the most generous version of the truth. I was still filling in gaps when I walked into that restaurant. It was a Tuesday. I've thought about that since, how it was a Tuesday, just like the day she disappeared. I was driving back from a site inspection about 90 minutes from home. The rain had started suddenly and heavily, the kind that turns your windshield into a gray wall, and I didn't trust my old eyes in that kind of downpour. I pulled off onto a road I didn't recognize and found a small place, 8 or 10 tables, a hand-painted sign above the door, the kind of restaurant that exists in the gap between towns and survives on truck drivers and lost travelers. I pushed the door open. A bell rang above my head. The smell of coffee and frying butter hit me immediately, and for a moment, it was almost comforting. I sat at a table near the window and picked up the laminated menu without really reading it. She came out from the back. I didn't recognize her immediately. She was moving with that careful, slow walk that pregnant women develop, one hand resting lightly on the side of her abdomen. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, and darker. Dyed, I realized later. She was wearing a plain blue apron over a white shirt. She looked tired in the way that people look when tired has become their normal state. She turned toward my table with a notepad in her hand, and the moment our eyes met, the color drained from her face so completely that I genuinely thought she might faint. I stood up. I don't know why I stood up. Some automatic instinct. "Clara," I said, and she made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a cry, and then she pressed her lips together and looked around the restaurant. There was one other customer, an old man by the door who was focused entirely on his soup. There was someone clattering in the kitchen. She looked back at me with eyes that were already filling with tears and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Please, please don't tell Daniel I'm alive." I sat back down. My legs made that decision for me. She poured me a coffee with hands that shook. She didn't ask if I wanted one. She put it in front of me and sat down in the chair across the table and stared at me the way that people stare at something they can't quite believe is real. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The old man by the door finished his soup. The rain hammered against the windows. Finally, I said, "Clara, are you all right?" And she pressed her hand to her mouth and nodded, and then shook her head, and then nodded again, as if the question was too complicated for a single answer. "The baby," I said, and I looked at her abdomen, and something happened in my chest that I don't have a clean word for. 8.5 months, she said quietly. I looked at her and I looked at the baby and I did the arithmetic in my head, and the numbers brought me to a time when she and Daniel were still married, still together, still, as far as I had believed, happy. "Does he know?" I asked. She shook her head. "Clara," I said, and I tried to keep my voice calm and level the way I do on job sites when something has gone wrong. "I need you to help me understand what I'm looking at right now, because I have spent 14 months, your parents have spent 14 months, believing that something terrible had happened to you." She flinched when I said that. Her eyes went to the table. "I know," she said. "I know what this looks like." "What does this look like?" I asked. "Tell me. Because from where I'm sitting, I don't know what to think." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't expected. Not guilt. Or not only guilt, something else. Something that looked a great deal like fear. "Robert," she said. She always called me Robert, never Dad, always Robert. And I had always liked that about her, her quiet insistence on getting things right. "If I tell you the truth, do you promise to really listen? Not to defend him, not to explain it away, just to listen?" I thought about saying that I couldn't promise anything. That was the logical response. But I looked at her, pregnant, tired, hiding in a roadside restaurant 90 minutes from everyone who knew her name, and I said, "I promise." She told me it started small. That's what she said first. It started small. The way she said it made me understand that she had rehearsed this. Maybe not for me specifically. Maybe just for the moment when someone finally asked. The first thing she told me was about the phone. About 8 months into their marriage, Daniel had started checking her phone. Not in an accusatory way, she said. Not at first. He would pick it up off the table while they watched television together and just glance at it. If she asked what he was doing, he would hand it back and smile and say he was just looking at the time. And she would think, well, that's strange, but all right. Because he was kind most of the time. Because he made her laugh. Because love makes you feel foolish for noticing things. But then he started asking her to share her location with him. He presented it as something practical, so I know you're safe when you're driving home late. And she thought, that's reasonable. That's caring. So she shared it. And then, she said, he started to get upset when I was somewhere he wasn't expecting. She described a night she stayed late at work for a product launch. She had told him in advance, twice. He had acknowledged it both times. But when she arrived home at 10 o'clock, he was sitting in the kitchen, and his face was the face she had come to think of as the cold face. Not angry exactly, not shouting, just completely still and unreachable in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have. He didn't raise his voice, she told me. He rarely raised his voice, but he asked her, calmly, quietly, why she had been at the building on Merchant Street between 6 and 7, because according to her location, she had stopped there. She had stopped to get food, she told him, a sandwich from the deli on the ground floor of the building. She had been there for 15 minutes. He stared at her for a long time. Then he said, I just want to understand your day. And she thought, this is love maybe. This is someone who cares. And she didn't say anything else about it. I was listening to all of this, and I was holding my coffee cup, and I was doing something I'm not proud of. I was building counter-arguments in my head. I was thinking, Daniel is an anxious person. Daniel had a difficult childhood in some ways. Daniel loves deeply, and sometimes that love comes out sideways. I was doing exactly what she had asked me not to do. I must have shown it on my face because she stopped talking and looked at me directly and said, I know what you're thinking, Robert. What am I thinking? I asked. You're thinking that checking someone's phone isn't that bad, she said. You're thinking that lots of couples share their location. You're thinking that I'm describing something that sounds like concern and calling it something uglier. She paused. That's what I told myself too. For 2 years, that's what I told myself. She looked at her hands on the table. Outside, the rain was easing slightly, turning from a roar to a hiss. He started to time my commute, she said. He calculated exactly how long it should take me to get from the office to our house. If I was more than 10 minutes late, he would call. If I didn't answer, he would call again. And again. One evening I was 20 minutes late because there was an accident on the main road and traffic was completely stopped. By the time I got home, he had called 11 times. She said that when she walked through the door that night, he hugged her, held her very tight and said he had been worried sick, and she stood there in his arms thinking, this is love. And she hated herself later for thinking that, because she understood by then what it actually was. Did he ever hurt you? I asked. I had to ask it. I asked it quietly and I watched her face carefully. She was quiet for a moment. Not the way most people mean when they ask that, she said. He never hit me. He never threatened me. He would have been horrified if you'd suggested it to him. He saw himself as a protector, as a devoted husband. She stopped. But there are ways to hurt someone that don't leave any marks. She told me about her friends. One by one, over the course of their marriage, she had seen less and less of them. It happened so gradually she barely noticed it happening. Daniel would be quiet and distant on evenings when she had plans, not angry, just withdrawn. And she would feel the weight of his silence and cancel the plans and stay home, and he would become warm again, and she would feel relieved. After enough repetitions, her friends stopped inviting her. She understood why. She just didn't understand, for a long time, how it had been arranged. She told me about her job. 18 months into the marriage, Daniel suggested she look for something closer to home. Her commute was long, he said. He worried about her on those roads, and she had found something, a smaller company, a shorter drive, a significant pay cut. She had taken it for him, and he had seemed so grateful, so warm about it, that she had felt for a little while like she had made the right choice. The new job had fewer colleagues, a quieter office, less reason to stay late. I can hear it all now, she said. Looking back, I can trace every single piece of it, but when you're inside it, it doesn't look like a plan. It looks like a relationship. It looks like compromise and love and two people building a life. She looked at me steadily. That's what makes it so hard to explain to someone who wasn't there. I didn't say anything. I was afraid of what would come out if I opened my mouth. She told me about the night she decided to leave. It was a small thing, she said. That's the thing about these moments. They're always small. They're never the big dramatic breaking point you imagine. She had been on the phone with her mother, a normal Sunday afternoon call, nothing significant. When she hung up, Daniel came into the kitchen and asked her what they had talked about. She said, just family things, the usual. He said, what specifically? She said, Daniel, nothing. We were just talking. He said, I just want to know about your day. Always that same phrase. I just want to know. And something in her, Some last reserve she didn't even know she was protecting. Just emptied. She stood there in the kitchen and looked at him and understood completely and finally that it would never stop. That there was no amount of transparency she could offer that would ever be enough. That the goalpost would always move. That she would spend the rest of her life being measured and monitored and slowly, quietly reduced. I didn't plan it properly, she told me. I know that. I know my parents suffered. I know you and Margaret suffered. I'm so sorry for that. Her voice broke on the last sentence, and she pressed her lips together for a moment before continuing. But I was scared that if I told anyone, if I told my parents, if I told you, that he would find out before I could get away. He was so good at making things look a certain way. He was so good at being the person everyone believed he was. She had taken a small amount of cash out of the account each week for 2 months. She had told no one. On a Tuesday morning, after Daniel left for work, she had packed one bag and driven herself to a bus station 2 towns over and left her car in the car park. She had bought a ticket with cash. She had turned her phone off. She had come here, this town, this life, because she had a cousin who had moved here years ago, someone peripheral enough that Daniel had never met her, never thought to contact her. The cousin had helped her find the apartment, find the job, had not asked too many questions, had offered a kind of quiet solidarity that Clara said she would be grateful for until her last day. "And the baby?" I asked. She looked down at her abdomen again, and something crossed her face, something complicated and private. "I found out 6 weeks after I left," she said. "I didn't know when I left." I sat with that for a moment. "Clara, he doesn't know he's going to be a father." "No," she said. "And you don't plan to tell him?" She looked at me. "Robert, I am going to raise this child to be a good and healthy person, to feel free, to feel safe." Her voice was very quiet. "I cannot do that with him in the picture. I cannot do that and also spend every day watching my child learn what I learned, looking for the signs in them." I understood what she meant, and I didn't want to understand it, but I did. We sat in silence for a long moment. The kitchen sounds had stopped. The other customer had left. Outside, the rain was almost finished, just a light patter against the glass now. I thought about Daniel. I thought about him as a boy, 7 years old, bringing me drawings of bridges because he knew I loved bridges. 14, crying in the car after his dog died, saying between sobs that he didn't understand why things had to end. 25, calling me at midnight from a work trip just to talk, just to hear a familiar voice. My son. My son. And then I thought about Clara's mother, who stopped eating. Clara's father, who aged 10 years. I thought about what I had told myself about my son's grief, how I had admired its quietness, its control. And I wondered, sitting in that chair, whether what I had been admiring was actually the performance of a person who was more composed than I could understand, or whether it was something else. Whether the control was not composure at all, whether Daniel had simply moved on more easily than any of us wanted to admit, whether that told its own story. I don't know how long I sat there. Clara had gotten up at some point and brought herself a glass of water and settled back into the chair with the careful movements of a woman in her final weeks of pregnancy. She watched me think. She didn't rush me. Finally I said, "What do you want from me, Clara?" She said, "I want you to let me be gone." "Your parents, I will contact my parents," she said. "Not right away, but I will. I'll find a way to let them know I'm safe. I'll find a way that doesn't lead him to me." She paused. But I needed someone in his life to know the truth. I needed someone who loves him to know. Because maybe, I don't know, maybe it might change something for him. Maybe if he knows that it came out eventually. That someone knows. She looked at her hands. Or maybe it won't change anything. Maybe this is just who he is. But I needed someone to know. She needed a witness. That was what she was asking for. She'd carried this alone for 14 months, and she needed one person connected to both of them, to hold the truth with her. I drove home in the thin, pale light after the rain. The roads were wet and clean. I'd promised nothing. I'd said only that I needed time to think. She had given me her cousin's number, not her own, her cousin's, and said she trusted me to make a decision I could live with. That was the hardest part. That phrase, a decision I could live with, because it implied that whichever direction I turned, some part of me would not be able to live with it easily. If I kept her secret, I was holding something enormous away from my son, from Clara's parents, who deserved to know their daughter was alive, and from the child, my grandchild, who would grow up without their father knowing they existed. If I broke her confidence, I was sending someone who had finally found safety back into the orbit of something that had slowly suffocated her. I was trusting my own reading of my son over her 14 months of lived experience. I was saying, I know him better than you do. I know him better than you know yourself. And I had to ask whether that was love or whether it was arrogance. I talked to Margaret that night. I had to. I sat her down at the kitchen table, and I took her hands and I told her all of it. She was very still while I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I've seen things, Robert, over the years, small things. I never said anything because I didn't know how to say them and because I thought maybe I was being unfair. What things? I asked. She shook her head slowly. The way he spoke to her sometimes when he thought no one was listening. The way she would go quiet at certain moments. I told myself it was just the way they were together, that all couples have things that look odd from the outside. She stopped. I should have asked her. We sat together in our kitchen, and I felt the weight of everything we didn't know about people we loved, had always loved, and I understood that love is not the same as knowledge, that you can love someone completely and still have deep, significant things about them be hidden from you, that this is not a failure of love. It is simply a fact about the limits of what we can see. We decided together. I want to be honest about that. It was not only my decision, even though I was the one who had been there. Margaret was part of it. I called Clara's cousin's number. When Clara came to the phone, I said, I'm going to contact your parents. Not to give them your address, just to tell them you're alive and safe. They deserve that much. I think you know that. A long silence. Then, okay, she said. Okay, yes. And I'm going to speak to Daniel, I said. Not to tell him where you are. I won't do that. But I'm going to have a real conversation with him, the kind we've never had, about the kind of person he wants to be, about what I've heard. He deserves the chance to hear it, even if he doesn't take it. Another silence. Do you think it'll change anything? She asked. I don't know, I said. Honestly, I don't know. Neither do I, she said quietly. But thank you, Robert, for listening. I called Clara's father the next morning. He picked up on the second ring. When I told him she was alive, he made a sound that I will carry inside me for the rest of my life. He said her name, just Clara. And then he couldn't speak anymore, and I heard him give the phone to his wife, and she said, Is it true? Is it really true? And I said yes. And she began to cry in the deep, releasing way that people cry when something they had given up on comes back. The conversation with Daniel was harder. Of course it was harder. I drove to his apartment. I sat down with him. He offered me coffee and I said no, and he looked at me with those eyes that had watched me his whole life, that still looked so young to me even at 31, and I said, Son, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me. Not to respond, not to defend yourself, just to hear. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, You found her. It wasn't a question. The way he said it, you found her. As if finding her had always been a possibility he had held on to. And I couldn't read it. I still can't. I don't know if it was relief or something else. I don't know what he had imagined had happened to her. I don't know what version of events he had built for himself in 14 months of silence. I told him what she had told me. Not everything, not the specific details that were hers alone, but the shape of it, the nature of it. I watched his face while I spoke, the way I had watched faces my entire career, looking for the moment when something true surfaces, the way flaws surface in concrete under certain pressures. He sat very still. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, That's not how it was. I know that's how it feels to you, I said carefully. I believe that's genuinely how it feels. He looked at me across the coffee table, my son, who I had held as an infant, who had called me from midnight hotel rooms just to hear my voice. and his eyes were full of something I couldn't name completely. Pain, yes, but also something that looked very much like the beginning of a real and genuine reckoning. Or maybe I'm telling myself that. Maybe that's the last generous interpretation I have left. I don't know how this ends. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you deserve honesty after everything I've just shared. I don't know if Daniel will change. I don't know if he's capable of looking at himself clearly, or whether the story he's built will protect him from ever having to. I don't know if Clara and her baby will be all right. I think they will. I think she is stronger than any of us knew. I think she was strong enough to do the hardest thing, which was not the leaving, but the staying gone. What I know is this. I drove home from Daniel's apartment and I sat in my garden as the evening came in, and I thought about all the ways we fail to truly see the people we love, all the convenient interpretations we reach for, all the gaps we fill with the most comfortable available story. I thought about Clara in her blue apron with her hand resting on her unborn child, whispering, "Please don't tell him I'm alive." And I thought about what it costs a person to get to the point where those are the words they say to their father-in-law in a roadside restaurant in the rain. What it costs and what it means. I have a grandchild coming. That child will not know me as the father's father. They'll know me however Clara decides I should know them, carefully, slowly, on terms she controls. And I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. Because some things, once broken, don't go back to the shape they were. And the kindest thing you can do is stop trying to force them. I walked into that restaurant to get out of the rain. I wasn't even hungry. But something in me, something I didn't know needed it, finally got fed. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Francisko's Stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story like this, share it with them. You never know whose life it might reach.